Thank you very much. I want to thank the Dean of the School of Built Environment, Alex Arness, for having invited me in the first place and persuaded me also to accept the invitation when I protested that I'm certainly no expert on the built environment. I'm somewhat intimidated at speaking to a group that includes people who have spent their lifetimes discussing and thinking about this. But Alex persuaded me that the issue of values in this area needs to be aired, needs to be discussed, and that I should have something to say about that. So I hope that I do, and in any case, if I don't, we're going to have time for questions and discussions. Afterwards, you'll tell me what I'm missing out on. So that's my slide. You've now had two titles, so we can move on. So the first question is, just the decision to build, obviously, is a decision that raises values, raises value issues. Should you be building at all? If so, why? This picture appears in Icon magazine, which is actually for architects, and you might think for architects, well, if you don't build, you're out of work. Clearly, building itself must be seen as a good thing, but it is possible to challenge that and to ask why we're building, what sort of values are we trying to achieve when we do build, and also what sort of values are we turning ourselves against, what sort of values are we negating. And those are questions that we all face. Many of you will have seen in this morning's paper, just yesterday, the State Premier announced the release of, I think it was 13,000 building allotments for new developments in the outer fringes of Sydney, which means that suburban homes will be built on suburban blocks in areas that are presently farmland. And there's all sorts of questions about do we want to build in that way? Do we want to build in those circumstances? With very limited public transport or no public transport at the moment in those areas, and perhaps 2 hours commuting. So there's an example of a decision that clearly raises values, and there's things that I'll be saying later on that will be relevant to that sort of decision. But so we have to look at the values that are involved. Sometimes in statements by architects and town planners, we find values concealed in statements that are not, at least on their face, value statements. And here's a statement by Le Corbusier, which doesn't have the words good or right or should or ought or values in it. It's all in the form of statements about what we must do. Statistics show us that business is conducted in the centre. This means that wide avenues must be driven through the centres of our towns. Well, if you think of those two sentences, the second one doesn't really follow from the first, as we now know quite well, but obviously there is some value suggesting this. Therefore, the existing centres must come down. Another imperative suggestion is that we don't really have a choice about doing that, no doubt because they don't have the wide avenues that they must have, and to save itself, every great city must rebuild its centre. So here is, in fact, one person's values, which could certainly, no doubt he could certainly have defended and put arguments for, but stated in a way that doesn't really invite you to reflect on the fact that there are values at stake and there are choices that you make. However, when you look at what some of the plans are, then I think everyone's values immediately get raised. This is a plan that Le Corbusier had for Paris, north of the Seine, and this doesn't mean in the far north. This is not some outer suburban fringe development. Those of you who know Paris will know this is the Seine, this is the Ile de Cité, the very heart of Paris, this is Notre Dame around here. We are just talking about a couple of blocks there, if you've known those areas of old streets and winding streets and alleys, not too many wide avenues. This was the plan to basically knock it all down and put up these delightful towers with lots of free space and views and parks and straight avenues. It looks a bit like parts of New York that I know. some also artificially created areas over there on the east side. But when this plan was released, of course, then people immediately realised that there were values at stake, and there was, fortunately, a substantial amount of opposition, and this never got built. But it's an example that I put not only in terms of where the values are, but also something that suggests that the history of urban planning has not always had the sorts of values that we have now, and that there's a certain amount of hubris in the planner who says we must do things like this, we must knock down, destroy and build again. But of course the values might be put in different and more friendly ways. Here's Fred Hilmer mentioned my Viennese ancestors' background. So here's an Austrian architect, Friedens Reich Hundertwasser, a name that he kind of invented for himself, incidentally. Friedens Reich means either realm of peace or rich in peace. You might think, well, this is obviously a more friendly-looking guy. You can take the values there. A nice quote, if man walks in nature's midst, then he is nature's guest and must learn to behave as a well-brought-up guest. Again, there's no statement of what we ought to do. It's again, this must is being used as if to say we don't really have a choice, and clearly you just have to look at Le Corbusier's plan to say, well, we do have a choice, we could do different things, and in places we have done very different things. So I think we would want to say, well, Hundertwasser values the idea that we live in harmony with nature in some way, as a guest of nature rather than imposing our values on nature. And that's certainly, again, something that we can and should discuss. What kind of attitude to nature should we have? And if we look at what Hundertwasser actually did, go to Vienna. Here's the Hundertwasser house. You can still see, looking pretty much like this. 52 apartments, 4 offices, 250 trees and bushes. Some of the trees growing inside the building with their branches coming out the windows. You can't see that quite so clearly maybe in this picture. And undulating floors. Hundertwasser didn't like level floors. He said undulations are melody for the feet. So it's a nice idea. How practical it is another question. But it's clearly a very different style of building the built environment, and you should, although it's not something that's been widely repeated in just that form, it's certainly something that we could say represents a set of values that we might want to, in some modified way, incorporate in the kinds of buildings and structures we have. And as well as the trees, which you see obviously there, Hundertwasser was very concerned about creating a community in the building. So that people didn't just live in isolated apartments, but there are communal spaces within the building, spaces for children to be in, to play communally, spaces for parents, for people, spaces for adults to meet, and so on. So that the building represents ideas of community and how people should live together in a way that seems more humanized than the apartment blocks that we saw in Le Corbusier's plan. So those are other sets of values. Now some people might say, well, why are we, given the not so great record of urban planning over the past century or so, why are we imposing our values on cities anyway? Why not simply allow the market to make those decisions in a kind of a laissez-faire manner? So here's an example of that. I used to live for a year. I was visiting in Washington, D.C., quite close to this place, Tysons Corner, and I was surprised when I checked up to find that it's actually become an example was used in a book, what's called Edge City, the way in which on the outer fringes, this is perhaps more in the United States than elsewhere, but it happens to some extent here too, you get these large centres springing up, get away from the city, which particularly in the United States where the centres of the city, less so now perhaps, but This was definitely true when we were living on the fringes of Washington in the end of the 70s, that the centres were somewhat dangerous places. They were mostly places where African Americans were living. They had high crime rates. There had been, in sort of relatively recent memory, there'd been the riots that followed the death of Martin Luther King. So it was a lot safer to be out there in the suburbs, and this kind of thing sprung up. But I was still surprised to read that Tysons Corner, which probably those of you who don't know that Northern Virginia metropolitan Washington area will have never heard of, is the 12th largest employment centre in the United States, with more commercial space than the downtowns of Miami, St. Louis or San Diego. I guess that's to some extent a sign of the flight of business from some of those downtown areas. So you end up with this really pretty ugly sort of space, and not only is it ugly visually, but it also has very poor public transport connections, so it involves a lot of commuting by car, which involves a lot of traffic, and all the frustrations of sitting in traffic, plus of course the pollution problems, the contributions to climate change and so on. There is now, they are now going to extend the Washington metro system, the subway system, finally to Tysons Corner, so that may help ease that a little bit, but that's going to be a very expensive project. So I would say that if you make this choice, you're not escaping values at all, you're allowing a particular set of values, basically the commercial values, to impose themselves on the community, on the built environment, and you may very well therefore get the results of decisions that are individually rational, in that it's individual for each individual. It's a rational decision to make, it's a rational decision for the developers to build these buildings, it's a rational decision individually for people to lease the space, it's a rational decision for people to obtain employment there, and then it's a rational decision for them to drive their car there. But while each decision is individually rational, the collective result is something that is not good on the whole, because nobody really wants to spend that much time sitting in their car in traffic jams, plus the various other problems that result from that kind of development. So that's why I think we can't actually escape from the idea of saying there are values in the built environment, and we need to think about those values, and we do need to make decisions, both as individuals and collectively, to try to have the values that we think of as the better values, the more important values, playing a role in that built environment. So what are these values that I'm talking about? Let me say a little bit about that. And I've got two distinctions here. The first one between intrinsic values and instrumental values should be fairly familiar. There are some things that we value for their own sake. You can think about what things you might value for your own sake, but I suppose for most people, your happiness, your enjoyment in life is something that you value for its own sake. Maybe your sense of fulfillment you value. On the other hand, if you value something like money, and it's pretty hard in a society like this not to have place some value on money, I would think that most of you, those of you who are psychologically healthy anyway, value it instrumentally rather than intrinsically. You value it for the things that it can buy, either for you or for others to whom you might give it or pass it on. It's like a number of other goods. There are many things that we want for what they bring us. So those are the instrumental values. And they're important, there's no doubt about it. We spend a lot of our time trying to create and maximize instrumental values, but underlying them all, and the more interesting philosophical questions, are the questions about what intrinsic values should we be concerned with, should we be trying to promote. Then the second distinction here is partial and impartial. Now, by partial here, I really mean this, not in the sense of just a part, but in the sense of the opposite of something that is impartial. So partial in the sense that we're considering only a part of the larger whole to which we belong, and the sense in which one might say, well, you're not making an impartial decision because you have a stake in this. You know, a judge's decision might not be impartial if it's about a company in which he holds a large shareholding, and we think that he ought to recuse himself from that decision and pass it over to some other judge who doesn't. Otherwise, he may be making a partial decision. So it's that sense of the term that I'm talking about. And let me go on and look at some of those values that we're concerned about. So there are many such things. And by the way, in partial values, I would include not only those that are explicitly for ourselves, but obviously we value things for those close to us. If we have children, we value things for our children, for other family members, for kin, for friends, for a circle of people that we care particularly about. So when I'm talking about partial values, I'm talking about that circle. And if you stop and think for a moment, a great deal of what we do in every day in our life is involved with thinking about those people first and foremost. So those are the partial values, and we may want for ourselves and for others, obviously, survival. Fortunately for most of us, that's not at stake, generally speaking, on a daily basis. Pleasure and the avoidance of pain, happiness or life satisfaction or fulfillment, which we can consider in various ways what's important to us in our lives, in our happiness, in our fulfillment. For some people, they may see that as equivalent to the value above it. It's simply that I want to have the largest possible amount of pleasure and the smallest possible amount of pain. Others may say, no, I have a wider sense of what I mean by a happy life or a satisfying life or a fulfilling life than simply that. And then I've already mentioned money as an instrumental value, and comfort, which we perhaps see also as part of happiness. If we're living in comfort, we're more likely to be happy than if we're in some degree of discomfort. Beauty, obviously, if we're talking about the built environment, we do have concern for aesthetic values. And then there's the question of status, which I think is more important for many people than we care to admit, that we want to show our importance, our significance, our standing in society in various ways. So we may want everybody to have a certain kind of status, but status can also be a relative good in which we compare ourselves with others, and that has an influence on decisions we make about the built environment as well. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So if we look at impartial values, then often they're very similar, but the difference is that when we value them impartially, we're expressing equal concern for all of those who can benefit in this way. All of those whose survival may be at stake, whose pleasure and avoidance of pain may be at stake, or their happiness, their comfort, the idea that they should live in an environment that has aesthetic value. Those are things that we can value impartially. So although they're similar sets of values, the fact that we're valuing them impartially can set up conflicts between the partial values and the impartial values. And the question then is, well, which values ought we be promoting here? So what I'm saying, and this is, if you like, the substantive value thesis that I'm defending, is to say we ought to be promoting values that make life better for everyone now and in future. So that's the overall claim, that in making decisions about the built environment, the values that we should be concerned with are not only for ourselves, the partial values, not only even for those who are living now, but for everyone now and in future. And I'll say a little bit more about the everyone in a moment, but just to come back to the point about goods like relative status, they can only alter the way the pie is distributed. If what people are concerned about is that they are somewhere near the top of the heap and they can show themselves to be somewhere near the top of the heap, you can't really value that impartially because obviously not everyone can be at the top of the heap or can be seen to be at the top of the heap. So in contrast to those values which we could promote for everyone, we have other values which it would be futile to try to promote from everyone because they're just not the kind of values that can be promoted impartially. It makes no real sense to try to do that. And that's important when we think about the built environment because, as I say, status is an important part of individual building decisions. Those interested in sort of the way in which humans act in terms of status, I recommend a book that's now more than a century old but is still very much worth reading by the American sociologist Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class, which talks about the way in which once people reach a certain amount of material comfort and satisfy their basic needs, then their desire to display their status starts to take over and takes a more and more important aspect of their lives. And although there are some things that we don't do that the people that Veblen was talking about do, for example, ladies don't wear white gloves, which for Veblen saw as a sign that obviously they were doing no real work, because if you wear white gloves, you can't work while wearing white gloves. They don't stay white very long. So that was how ladies of a certain class of society showed their status. We don't do that, but we do other things, and obviously relevant to this is we build houses that display our status, and sometimes we build public buildings that display the status of various people involved in building them as well. So that's definitely a relevant aspect of human nature in thinking about the built environment. I said that we should be promoting these values for everyone, but we need to think a little bit about who everyone is here. Do we just mean Australians? Do we mean humans everywhere? Do we mean future generations? Do we mean other sentient beings? Do we include the natural environment? So on this list, I think we should say, yes, it does include everyone. Certainly, we ought to be concerned not just about Australians, but we ought to be concerned about humans elsewhere. We, at least in our rhetoric, we pay lip service to the idea that all human beings are of equal worth and significance. We don't want to say that people in other countries don't count because they're beyond our borders. I also think that we ought to be giving the same concern to future generations as we give to the present generation. That's clearly a very significant claim when we consider that our lifestyle is currently changing the climate of the planet in ways that are going to have probably irreversible effects for many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years to come, then it's very important to say we give equal weight to future generations. Some economists discount the future. If you look at some of their calculations about the future, they build in a discount, an annual discount rate for the future. And those discount rates are very significant in that if you have compounding interests, you work out the maths, you have a 5% annual discount rate, compounds, it means that losses of $1 million that are going to occur a century or so in the future are the kinds of sums that we might spend on an evening out for two with a good dinner and going to the theatre. That's the sort of thing that you're talking about when you discount annually. I think that we should not be doing that. I think there's no real basis for saying that the future is less important or less significant than now. There is some basis for saying that if we invest sums now, they will grow in future, but some of the discount rates that have been used are far beyond the safe return on investment that you could talk about in that way. Plus, when we're talking about environmental values, I think discounting them at rates of investment doesn't take account of the fact that future generations are quite likely to value these things much more highly. They'll inflate as they have in the past, as we recognise, for example, how precious those areas of wilderness are that we have preserved. I was fortunate enough to just spend a couple of days now in the Blue Mountains, and I think every one of you here, and I know people generally would be thankful to those people who were visionary enough, going back to the more than a century ago when the Blue Mountains was first made a national park, and then through the 70s when those parks were extended and increased. And probably if people a century ago had discounted future values, they would have said, well, you know, it's not worth it, we could get more by developing these areas. But now we recognise how precious these are, and I think that's another reason for saying why we should not be applying standard economic rates of return to discounting of the natural environment. Admittedly, there are some uncertainties about what future generations will need, or indeed even if future generations are going to exist. So to that extent, some very small rate of discount for the uncertainties might be legitimate. But in general, I would want to say the interests, the well-being of future generations counts as much as the well-being of our own generation, and that imposes a very significant burden on us. I also want to mention other sentient beings. I'm not going to be talking a great deal about that tonight. Many of you will have read things that I've written about that topic and will know that I think that we ought to be giving equal concern to similar interests, whether a being is human or non-human. The pain of a dog or a pig or any being that can feel pain, wherever we draw that boundary of where the limits of consciousness or sentient experience is, I think those interests ought to not be discounted just because it's the pain of a being that's not a member of our own species. So I do think that that matters. When we get to the natural environment, philosophically I think there's more questions that can be raised about whether this is an intrinsic good or an instrumental good. These other ones, I think we're all talking about intrinsic goods here. The well-being of those beings I've been talking about is intrinsically good. Is it intrinsically good that we have preserved, let's say, the Blue Mountains National Park, independently of the benefits that that brings to human beings now, to human beings in future, to the non-human animals who inhabit that environment now and in future? Is it a good thing that an ecosystem has been preserved, that those magnificent sandstone cliffs have been preserved? People differ on that, and I'm not going to try and resolve it now. I don't think it's important for me to do so. You can have different views about that. But either way, I think the natural environment remains tremendously important, whether you see it as having intrinsic value or as having only instrumental value. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about climate change, since this is obviously a current topic as of last Sunday's announcement that we will be getting a carbon tax. Just a reminder that one of the reasons why we're doing this is that we are currently using about 5 times our share of greenhouse, the capacity of our atmosphere to absorb our greenhouse gas emissions. So simply in terms of our concern for people elsewhere in the world, for future generations, it's not simply that we want to try to protect our environment, that we want to try and reduce the risks of droughts of the sort that we had until a year or two ago here, that Australia will, on most predictions, become a much worse place to live if climate change continues. It's also that we share this world with a large number of other people who generally, fortunately, emit far fewer greenhouse gases than we do. If that were not the case, we would already be in a much more critical situation than we are now, and we're already in a highly critical situation. So in terms just of saying, how do we divide up the capacity of the Earth to absorb our greenhouse gases, we are really taking what is, by any stretch of reasonable principles of justice, not ours, taking more than our share of this capacity of the atmosphere to absorb our greenhouse gases without bringing disaster on us all. Just as an illustration of how bad this situation is, here's a proposal from the German Scientific Advisory Council, which has been doing research in this area and has tried to work out what the world could cope with up to 2050. This is a budget for 2050. How much greenhouse gases the world could absorb during this period, which is already actually now running, this period of 40 years from 2010 to 2050. And they're talking about compliance with a 2 degrees Celsius guardrail with a 67-degree probability. What does that mean? Well, it means that what can the world emit in terms of greenhouse gases so that we do not exceed warming of 2 degrees Celsius with a 2/3 probability, the 67% probability. So they're not saying that even if we comply with this budget that they're dividing up here, they're not saying it's certain that we will be able to restrict climate change to 2 degrees Celsius. They're saying it's 67% probable. To get to 100% probability, they thought would be too drastic, more drastic than we have. And as I'll explain, if it's not clear from the figures already, this is already an extremely drastic scenario. So the 2% guardrail is the level that they believe will mean that while things will become more difficult in various ways, while sea levels will rise, while rainfall patterns will change, and places will become hotter, they think that we can perhaps avoid catastrophic climate change of a sort that might really endanger the lives of most of the people on the planet. So that's what we're really talking about in terms of trying to restrict climate change to no more than a rise of 2 degrees Celsius. Incidentally, at the Copenhagen conference a year or two back, where there was discussion of this 2% rise, a number of our neighbours, the low-lying Pacific islands like Tuvalu and Kiribati, protested that a 2 degrees Celsius warming would be enough to simply wipe out those nations, because sea levels would rise to the point where the waves were above the land that they have. So they were asking for a 1.5% limit, but the rest of the world rejected that as essentially impossible to achieve. Now, what do these figures then mean? So we're talking about a world budget in billions of tonnes of carbon dioxide of 750 billion. And here it's divided up using the 2008 emissions. How many years do you still have at current rates, at business as usual, before you exhaust the total budget that you have as a country for 2050, if we're talking about equal per capita shares, which, as I say, seems a fair way to divide it up. Now, Australia is not on this list, but Australia is not that different from the United States in terms of its per capita emissions. So the United States had just 6 years, and clearly, since nothing much is happening in the United States is going to be using up its entire 2050 budget sometime around 2016, or maybe because of the economic slowdown, maybe it'll take a couple more years to do so. But you could certainly say by 2020, unless something dramatic and surprising happens, the United States will have used up its entire budget for 2050, and Australia really would be in a pretty similar sort of position. So if we do not have significant reductions, you could say that from 2020 onwards, we will actually, any emissions that we have, any net emissions, will be using up quotas that other nations, in fairness, are entitled to. And the most dramatic example of that, if you look at the nations, some of the poorest nations in the world, like Burkina Faso in Africa, its current emissions are so low that whereas we will use up our budget in, let's say, 6 to 10 years, it will only use up its budget in 2,892 years. That's the discrepancy. That's the degree of disproportion in terms of what we're using and what they are using. And yet they're the ones who are going to be probably worse affected. I mean, Australia is going to be badly affected. It's already been badly affected. But you know, even if our farmers were wiped out by drought, which would be a very bad thing, they would not starve. We are still a wealthy enough nation, at least for the foreseeable future, for them to find other forms of employment, or if they don't, for us to support them at least to the level where they're not going to starve. But if you're a peasant farmer in Burkina Faso relying on rainfall to grow food and the rains fail, you don't have any social security to fall back on. You don't have much prospect of employment if you move to a city and try and find a job. So we are going to essentially be imposing much more harm and suffering on people in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, who are dependent on rainfall and dependent on agriculture to survive. So I think that chart makes clear just how dramatic the climate change situation is and why this has to be a priority for anything we do in the built environment, as long as we are thinking about, as I say we should, not just Australians, not just the present generation, but people all over the world now and for future generations. So, and this is another example of the kind of consequences I already mentioned Tuvalu, but this happens in many parts of the world, in coastal India and coastal Bangladesh, for example, low-lying delta regions, very rich farmland, therefore highly populated, because people can't afford to leave rich farmland uncultivated, but very low-lying and already periodically subject to flood, and in some cases already becoming uninhabitable, and some people having to move away from lands that they farmed as sea levels rise, and all the evidence is that that rise is going to accelerate. Okay, so what kinds of things can we do that are relevant to the built environment? Some of these are pretty obvious, and I'm sure you've discussed them a lot, and they're being discussed in cities elsewhere. But this first one relates to so what I would regard as the retrograde move that the Premier announced yesterday. We should be, if we're trying to make affordable housing for people in Sydney, we should be finding ways to increase density in urban areas, not extending the suburban development, which, at least in present technologies, is inevitably high energy usage, to areas that are currently farmland or natural environment. Obviously, we should be having strict environmental standards for new developments, and to some extent, some of that is happening. We have new building codes which require 6-star sustainability levels for houses, which is definitely a significant improvement on what we've been building in the past. So that's certainly a direction that needs to be encouraged. And if we can make the economics go in that direction, then that's going to make things work better as well. And that's what the carbon tax proposal is supposed to do, which is why I welcome it. I doubt that $23 per tonne of carbon is enough for that, but it's definitely a positive step, and I hope that we'll gradually see that moving up once we shift to a cap and trade scheme. So I think that that's an important step. And of course it's also important, while mentioning the carbon tax proposal, that there are going to be substantial amounts of money going into research in renewable clean energy, because I think we have the potential to do that with solar, and that's certainly what we ought to be doing. If we want to retain a lifestyle that uses power in anything like the scale that we've been doing it up to now, we need to find those clean sources of energy. And I welcome the fact that there's going to be substantial amounts of research funding going into the development of that. Smaller things like safe cycle lanes or cycle streets, I think are also things that we need to encourage as part of that green lifestyle, to get away from the car, and also, of course, in general, part of a healthier lifestyle as well. And that's something that we are really quite a long way behind on. If you've been to some European cities that have far advanced in this, obviously the Netherlands has been very bicycle friendly for a long time. Cities like Copenhagen also have wide bike lanes separated from traffic to make for safe cycling, and I think that encourages people to do that. I was in Copenhagen a couple of years ago, and my Danish publisher there was telling me that that he cycles in, though it has about a 20-minute cycle to work each day, and I said, but surely you don't do it all through the winter, knowing what the Danish winter is like. And he said, well, there's maybe half a dozen days a year when there's too much snow or ice around and I don't do it, but the rest of the year, winter or summer, he does. You just need to dress properly for it, he says. And the same is true, of course, in the Netherlands, where they have a lot more rain than we do. Admittedly, they're a bit flatter than Sydney is, but not all of Sydney is hilly. And I think we may also see the development of electric-assisted cycles to help people get up the hills, which can be low energy because they recharge the battery from when you're cruising down the hill. So that may make it a lot easier for other people who are not quite fit enough to go up some of the hills around here to do so as well. And obviously public transport is key to this as well, and that's something else that we need to be putting resources into. So these things are mostly pretty obvious, but they are going to make important differences, and in developing the built environment we need to be planning for them. So just a little bit about urban density. I've talked about some of the advantages of that, and not only in terms of sustainability, but in terms of making public transport more efficient, encouraging people to walk more, which is obviously good for their health as well, discouraging use of your own car, apartments requiring less energy to heat, lower energy use per capita. It's not a great surprise if you think about these things to know that the most energy efficient people in the United States are New Yorkers, because New York is the most densely built city in the United States and has the highest rates of public transport use, has New Yorkers walk more than people in other cities because the streets are generally friendly for walking, and the apartments use less energy, especially of course if you're talking about heating in winter. The fact that you're part of a larger building and the apartment above and below you and beside you are warm saves energy in heating. More space for wildlife and agriculture in the natural environment, obviously, if you build in a dense way. And I think another important aspect is that you have the critical mass for a whole range of different community groups and interests, which you don't have if you're much more spread out, unless you're going to spend a lot of time driving, which, as I've said already, is not a great idea. So that doesn't mean that you can't have various things that people want to have in their suburban backyards. For example, it doesn't mean that you can't grow vegetables, something that I've enjoyed doing in various places that I've lived. You can have this quite a dense area of suburb or satellite of Lisbon, Amadora, where just something I pulled off the web, nice vegetable allotments, quite common in a lot of European cities, and more common now here in Australian cities than they used to be, but still not very widespread, but certainly something that enables people to produce their own food, to get the sense of local food, but also to build up community, because you share the allotment area with other people, you meet other people, you've got a surplus of broccoli and they've got a surplus of Brussels sprouts, so you share, and it brings people together as well as providing some green space. And in fact you can be a little bit more structured about it and organise it as a city, as the City Farm in Chicago does, where there's actually organised compost collection from restaurants. All of that great compost that gets standardly thrown out from city restaurants can be made into good compost, can be put into the farm, can then be used to produce organic produce, to raise some money for causes or for people who are working there, and eventually feeds back into the restaurants, and the cycle goes around. So there's a whole lot of schemes that we can do to make cities more environmentally friendly, both for the natural environment and for communities. Okay, but let me talk a little bit about, since when we're talking about the built environment, we're talking to a significant extent in a school like this of educating architects as well as town planners. Let me talk a little bit about the ethical dilemma that faces the architect in architectural practice, because the architect's role is generally seen to be providing what the client wants. But of course the client has values, and the client's values are not necessarily the same as the architect's values. So there's immediately a question set up as to what the role of the architect ought to be and what those values might be. So one of those relates to the size of the homes that are being built. I've already mentioned, obviously, in terms of sustainability, having very large homes is not going to be a good thing because it takes more energy to heat them, takes more resources to build them, and you have less dense housing if individual families have very large houses. And this is quoting a piece from the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of years ago. Australia, in terms of its new homes, has the largest homes in the world, larger even than the United States, significantly larger than other European countries. And I think this relates to status needs again as much as anything. I mean, people of my generation were quite used to growing up in families. I grew up in a middle class, upper middle class family, but the family had one bathroom. Nobody thought anything about the fact that there was only one bathroom in the house. Now I think a family like ours, building a house like that, as my parents built the house, would automatically put in at least 2 bathrooms. The rule seems to be generally now a bathroom for every bedroom plus one for the guests. So I don't quite know what you do with all the bathrooms, but that seems to have become a need. I can't believe, if we go back to the intrinsic values we're talking about, I can't believe that it actually makes people happier on the whole to have that amount of bathroom space. It certainly makes the houses larger and use more resources. So, but the dilemma for the architect then is, well, if the client comes and says, I want this home like this, what is the architect going to do? He's going to say, well, I'm not going to build a home like that. Clearly, the client can then go and say, well, I'll find myself an architect who will, and probably won't have to look very far for it. The other factor is that architects typically make their living by a percentage commission on the building project, and so the more costly the building project, the larger the commission. So the architect doesn't have any financial interest at all in trying to reduce the size of the building structure. And I think there's a significant dilemma there, and it's difficult to see really how you resolve it unless you have some kind of regulation which at least puts, if not prohibitions, then financial disincentives to building large houses which are not in the long run sustainable and not what we see as desirable for the community. There's also questions of design, of aesthetics and sustainability. I had beauty as one of those values. And that clearly can clash with sustainability. Here's a famous American architect's glass house, Philip Johnson's glass house in Connecticut. A very striking design. I don't know that I'd like to live in it, I must say, but nevertheless, a striking architectural design. How many stars would that get under today's building codes with all that glass and no eaves? Not many, I would think. So there's clearly a problem about building just allowing aesthetics free rein once you take sustainability into account. And here's a Frank Gehry building in New York, which also has a lot of glass and looks best with a lot of lighting on, as you can see. And it does look very striking, I must admit. I know this building quite well, because it's, I'd say it's not a highly sustainably designed building. And you have to ask again, well, are we building here a monument to an architect or to a corporation or to the CEO of the corporation who wanted to have this kind of monument built? And what do we think about the question of whether we should be building in this manner if in fact it's not the most sustainable way to build? Just by contrast, here's a 7-star house being built in Victoria for VicUrban. It maybe doesn't look as great as the Philip Johnson house or as some other houses that you can see. And you know, maybe even within the 7-star limitations you could do better. But certainly it's, you know, it does impose restrictions on design. Small windows here, shading to keep the sun off the windows. There's more glass here, but it's more recessed. So you are going to have to build in a different way. We're going to have to see things as beautiful if they are sustainable. We're going to have to see them as beautiful in terms of what they do for the planet and the beauty of living with a low carbon footprint. And I think that's going to have to become part of our aesthetics. So we see the others as, you know, yes, in some sense you can say they're beautiful, but if you think about them in a slightly different way, then they become perhaps ostentatious in some sense, in that you're basically saying, I don't care about the rest of the world, I care about this monument, this sculpture, this shape, this design. And I want to suggest if we really take values seriously, we shouldn't be doing that. We need to develop a different aesthetic that appreciates the low carbon footprint, the sustainable way of living in the environment. Whoops, since it's an Utzon lecture, I have to show this building, I'm sure. And it's, you know, you could ask a similar question, having put up the Frank Gehry building. So what about this building? It doesn't have quite that much glass on display, but certainly used a lot of resources to build, more than was predicted from the plans. But other things that we could do to build like this, but to make it sustainable. Could these surfaces, for example, be used for photovoltaic energy generation? Why not? I think we're developing integrated photovoltaic materials, so maybe the building of the future is going to have its sails redesigned so that they're directed to capture the maximum amount of sunlight and thereby to provide the maximum amount of power for the building and for other houses around it. I don't think that that's impossible for the buildings of the future. So I'm not saying we can't build buildings which are striking designs, but I think they're going to have to be striking within a different set of limitations. Okay, and the final thing that I'm really going to talk about, because I'm pretty much up to my hour, is in talking about values and architects and the built environment, we shouldn't just be thinking about the work that we do here in Australia, even though that clearly has a global effect, as I've been saying. We should be talking about what architects can also do to display their values in at least part of their professional lives by doing pro bono work, by doing work for the public good, as doctors and lawyers sometimes do. There's no reason why architects can't as well. So here, for example, is the 1%, a program of public architecture. You can go to this website and take a look at the public architecture program. There's firms that are willing to give 1% of their time to pro bono work. Not a very large percentage, in fact. A lot of law firms give more like 10, 20 or even 30%, or allow their allow their employees to do much larger percentages of their time in pro bono work. But even 1% is certainly a start. And here's another. This is Architects Without Frontiers, an Australian group. At least at the moment, I can't say go to the website, because when I looked at it a couple of days ago, it had a sign up saying undergoing maintenance, and there was nothing much more than this on it, but hopefully it will do its maintenance. And the significant thing here is that it is specifically trying to connect Australian design with community groups in the Asia-Pacific region. So going offshore to try and use design services to help people who can't afford to employ architects themselves, but where maybe with an emphasis on, as it says, participatory, community-focused and long-term sustainable design for communities in need. So that seems to me a very worthy goal, a very worthy ideal that we ought to be thinking about doing more about. Obviously there'll be a steep learning curve in doing this kind of work, but I do think that we can and should be making a contribution there. And this is my final slide, just to refer to a similar project in Alabama called the Rural Studio, which was not actually going abroad, but was trying to design houses for the rural poor in Alabama, and was doing that, was providing decent low-cost housing for, again, people who could not afford architects themselves. And I like the quote from the founder of the Rural Studio, Samuel Mockbee: "If architecture is going to nudge, cajole and inspire a community to challenge the status quo into making responsible changes, it will take the subversive leadership of academics and practitioners who keep reminding students of the profession's responsibilities." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a word of praise for the much maligned Lord Corbusier. Corbusier was a polemicist. I think the first quote you gave was in that vein. It was a polemical quote. The plan for Paris was part of a competition of which his seems to be the only one they ever print or they ever reproduce, and it was about density, how you could use density, and I think you alluded to that later in your discussion. So he wasn't a bad man. Thank you.
I think the record is a little mixed, but I will bow to your greater knowledge of
Thanks again, Professor Singer. Paul Noble, a Sydney poet, I suppose I might say. I draw your attention to Judith Wright's later poetry, which shows an extraordinary awareness of the iteration of all the species on the earth, and Martin Rees's book, Our Final Century, in which he said we have a 50-50 chance of surviving the next 50 years. Now, my question, you are a Federation Fellow, aren't you? I don't think that was mentioned.
No, I'm not a Federation Fellow.
But you were one.
No, I've never been a Federation Fellow.
I think you should be.
Thank you, thank you.
But the question is, the Nouvelle Observateur, you'll know all about this, had a famous list of Grand Penseurs du Monde, the 25 greatest thinkers in the world, of which Martha Nussbaum is the only woman and will appear in Sydney in August. I just wanted to ask you if you could name some others.
You want me to name some other women?
Other great thinkers, not necessarily women. I thought you might be a good person to ask this question.
Well, look, you're obviously putting me on the spot here. You're talking about contemporary thinkers? You're wanting to... Look, I mean, you know, I think some of our great thinkers are people who've been thinking about science in a variety of ways. For example, I'm a great admirer of people who've been thinking about evolution and its impact. So Richard Dawkins is one of those people who I would certainly have on my list. Among public philosophers, I think there's not a hugely talented list. You mentioned Martha Nussbaum, and obviously a lot of people would have people like Amartya Sen, who's written about justice and about development as well on their list. He was one of the 25? Anthony Appia, okay, good. So that's Anthony Appia, for those who don't know, is a Princeton colleague of mine. And for that matter, so is another person who spent a lot of time in Australia, Philip Pettit, who many people admire highly and whose work has been influential among some governors. It's often not people who are particularly well known in these fields. But look, I think, you know, I won't continue because it would take a while and it's not directly relevant to what I'm talking about. I think we have so many different fields of thought that it's really very difficult to pull in any small number, and you're inevitably going to leave out a lot of people from different areas.
Professor Singer, George Papanikolaou, my name. I just wanted to just pick up on a detail to actually flesh out what I want to ask you about. In the slide with Corbusier, the word centre was spelled two different ways in two different parts of there's the ER and there's the RE. Now, I'm not being pedantic just for the sake of being pedantic. The reason I asked that is just to indicate there are differences in values which are as small as that. It can go up to the metric versus the imperial system, which is still there, and different gauges in railways we had in Australia, which caused all kinds of problems. So the nub of the question is, the centre you allude to, or Corbusier alluded to, can also refer to the kind of political or social centre from which values can then be expressed and then developed and be actualised. So I wanted to ask you, because your experience both in America and Australia, how has the centre, the political and social centre, changed in your experience over time? I think it's fracturing under the influence of the internet and social media and so forth, and therefore maybe make it more difficult to get a political or social consensus than to actually drive through these changes in values. And we're seeing that now with the carbon tax debate in Australia, which has swung from basic agreement now to basic antipathy in the popular mind. So just wondering if you wanted to comment on how that centre has changed in its character.
Yes, well, it's a very acute observation you began with, and that's probably due to my uncertainty as to whether I'm in the United States or Australia in terms of writing. But it's a nice point. Certainly in the United States, you do get the feeling that the centre has broken down, and that's really partly because of the demise of the Liberal Republicans. You don't have to think very far back to the days when you had people like Nelson Rockefeller, who was a Republican, but who would really barely find a place in the Republican Party of today. Even Richard Nixon, you know, much as those of us from the Vietnam War generation despised and hated Richard Nixon, I mean, he comes out as a quasi-socialist by the standards of present-day Republicans. You know, he made proposals for healthcare reform that were at least as far-reaching as what Obama has done, and Obama is, of course, denounced by Republicans as a socialist, etc., for doing what he's trying to do. So that's a major factor. Whether it's due to the internet, I don't really know. Some of you may know I'm speaking about some questions relating to the internet at the Opera House tomorrow night. It's partly due to cable TV, I think. I mean, if you just switch from watching Fox to watching either the major free-to-air networks or MSNBC, something like that, the more liberal cable networks, there's just a world of difference. They're just in completely different worlds. And if you get people who are fixed to Fox and getting all their news from Fox, then they're going to have these, what to me seem completely weird, far-right views. So I think that is a real problem, and I don't quite know what's going to happen. I don't think in Australia we're nearly that bad at this stage, and that I think it's a pity that there are people, you know, if you look at the Liberal Party today or the Conservative side of politics, again, you don't have to go back very far to find people who were significant political figures who now would be too small L liberal, you know, basically too centrist, to fit within that party. And of course, you know, even the fate of Malcolm Turnbull over climate change is a matter of deep regret, I think. So, you know, I can only hope that that is going to change. I don't think we're as much committed to it as the United States seems. But unfortunately, we're all affected by what happens in the United States, and that's why we do need a change there.
Hi, my name's Cameron Ellis, and I'm a student in Sydney, and I was wondering whether or not you think that currently in Australia, or perhaps globally, there are the kind of public or private institutions to allow the, I suppose, interdisciplinary work to bring about change within highly specialised fields such as architecture or ethics or these other areas that need to come together to have some of the effects that you're looking for in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that ethics has certainly, you know, reached out. If I talk about the area that I know best, ethics has reached out and become more applied over the last 20 or 30 years. And we have new fields that are developed where, you know, for example, bioethics, which I've worked in, which really didn't exist when I was an undergraduate in the 60s, and even in the 70s was still very small, but eventually people in the healthcare professions sort of saw the need to get more explicit discussions of some of the ethical issues that they face. And then we've had similar moves into environmental ethics and business ethics, and a lot of discussion about animals and ethics and so on. So I think we can get that sort of interdisciplinary nature. We can get people looking at ethics in the built environment, for example, and ethics and architecture. So we can get some interdisciplinary there. But of course, as you say, there's a whole lot of other areas of urban studies and trying to understand how communities work best that really need to feed into questions about the built environment. And you know, I believe that's happening, but the Dean could certainly say more about that than I can, to what extent that's happening on this campus and other places around Australia. I totally agree that it needs to happen. It's going to take individuals who are committed to that vision of architecture and urban planning to make it happen.
Well, I think we might wrap the evening up, and it's my last duty to really thank Peter. Before I do so, I might conclude the Corbusier debate with a comment that Hinderwasser and Corbusier both did at least one undulating floor. That says about architects and the expressive potential of architecture, but there you go. So I think we've really been privileged to see the dissection and reconstruction of the fundamental value system that we operate under, and I was really pleased to hear it because I haven't heard it before, and I was very keen to say that we're certainly on the impartial side of things at our faculty. We're trying to build a foundation on impartial values, and it's critical that we do so. Thank you very much for coming here and giving this talk. We have a small gift. It's a trilogy of books which we'll post to you, unless you wish to take with you. Actually on Designing Cities by Emeritus Professor Cuthbert, which includes a lot of discussion on the political economy and other drivers of change. So thank you very much, and this is from us.
Thank you.
As our small contribution.